that would not be driving people into crime, and so getting to the root cause, Madam Speaker.
Reprise du débat, resuming debate. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my dear colleagues who are here tonight. First of all, I'll say thank you once again to the Nunavut MP.
For Nunavut for bringing this forward for emergency debate. It's been an emergency for some time, and that's why I was relieved when the Speaker decided it met the definition of an emergency for a debate. But as the honourable member for Nunavut put it when she made the argument to the Speaker, it's become so common, it's become almost expected that police forces, when confronted with a First Nations person, an Indigenous person in this country, even on a wellness check where they're supposed to be sent forward to make sure that the person in question is safe, the person in question is killed. It's far too common. There have been a number of studies in Canada. We can talk about them. I know the specific examples that lead us to the debate tonight start with something like this APTN headline: 15 days and 6 Indigenous people have died when coming in contact with police across Canada. And we've been told, again, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary quite rightly pointed out, we were told in the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We were told in the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Would add that we were told by a report that came out in June 2021 from this Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. That report is titled Systemic Racism in Policing in Canada. That report refers to a witness, Honourable Michelle Bastruk, who actually said the culture within the RCMP is toxic. So let's be clear, this isn't 1 or 2 incidents that can be explained away because an RCMP officer thought something was a threat, that they were faced with an Indigenous person that they thought was threatening them. Stephen Dedham shot and killed by the RCMP just earlier this month. After he'd been shot 3 times, he was handcuffed and told he was under arrest as he lay there dying. He'd been shot in the chest in Elsipogtog First Nation, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy territory. But that's not the first time, as we know, in summer of, June 2020, that 2 Mi'kmaq, in the territory of Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy people, that Rodney Levi of another New Brunswick First Nation was shot and killed by the RCMP on a wellness check. And a member of the Edmundston, New Brunswick police force killed a young woman from the territory of Vancouver Island, where I'm honoured to be friends with her family and know them well. Chantel Moore was killed on June 4th, 2020. Her killing is one for which there are no answers yet because the reports have been whitewashes. She was killed by a lone RCMP officer, or rather Edmundston police officer, who was a tall, burly man who woke her up at 3 in the morning because they'd been called to do a wellness check. He did not have a second officer with him, and he shot her 4 times. She was 5'0". This is an insufficiently investigated murder. So let's get back to what kind of solutions we could look to. I've mentioned a number of reports, and one that doesn't come up very much in this context, but I think contains many clues for what we need to do for solutions, is the mass casualty report on the RCMP massive failure to stop a killer on a shooting, sometimes described as a shooting spree, but that makes it sound like they were shopping. A murderous rampage by a known dangerous man. He was known to be dangerous because of multiple reports for over a decade before he started killing people in Portapique, Nova Scotia, 2 years ago, April. He was known because so many reports had been made to the RCMP that he had illegal guns. It was known that he was a threat to people around him. And various racialized people over the years, when you read the report, you find, had reported him for beating up on them or robbing them. And the RCMP notes to the report say, we don't believe the complainant, because why would a wealthy denturist, we might insert the words white, Why would a white, wealthy man beat up on poor and racialized people? They never investigated the complaints against him over a 10-year period. Now, that mass casualty report led our national newspaper, I'll still call it the national newspaper, but the Globe and Mail is certainly not a left-wing or radical press. It is establishment with a capital E. And the Globe and Mail editorial, after reading the mass casualty report, said the RCMP as an institution must be torn down to their foundations, and then the foundations must be dynamited. Those are strong words, but when you read that report, you realize the institutionalized systemic racism, as well as sexism, the unwillingness to believe that because someone had a domestic violence situation and was reported constantly to be a threat to the life of his intimate partner, not by the intimate partner, there was an issue of coercive control. We've got to get that bill passed while we're here, by the way. But the issue of systemic racism comes screaming out of the report on the mass casualty report out of Nova Scotia for the killings in Portapique. That report pointed out this issue of training. The RCMP don't get as much training as even municipal police forces. I've talked a lot to the chief of police in Victoria, BC, where I've watched the officers in Victoria, BC in the municipal police force de-escalate tense situations, get people mental health supports when they need them. They don't shoot first and ask questions later. I'm very grateful to Chief of Police Dalmanic in Victoria and other municipal forces across Canada. Chief of Police in Montreal is another fine example. But again, municipal police forces, as the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary mentioned, police forces in Thunder Bay, police forces in Edmundston. We've seen municipal police officers also exhibit a systemic racist attitude towards racialized and Indigenous people, where guns are pulled when people have been sent out on wellness checks. So solutions, we can go through volumes of reports. From the other place, another expert in this area, Senator Kim Pate, who's done a lot of work looking at what has already been mentioned here tonight, the expanding population of Indigenous women in our prisons. The systemic racism is not confined to the RCMP, let's be clear. It's a Canada-wide problem. It's manifested in the laws, the expectations, the doctrine of discovery, the Indian Act, we can go on and on. But I think it's really critical that we do a couple of things and do them fast. I've said this to the Minister of Public Security before. I think we need to ensure, and we need to take the time to go through the social media of every single person in this country who wears a uniform and carries a gun. That includes the kind of people who were actually drove through the gates at Rideau Hall determined to shoot the Prime Minister. Go through social profiles of every single person in this country who wears a uniform and carries a gun, and look for any evidence of white supremacy. Look for people wearing a patch of the thin blue line. Recently in British Columbia, a friend of mine who was a Fairy Creek supporter to stop the old-growth logging there, recently the Public Complaints Commission, just last week, ruled that the police arrest and handcuffing and insistence that somehow my friend from Salt Spring Island was violating the law by refusing to give the RCMP his name. This is the RCMP rogue unit called the Community and Industrial Response Group, and in demanding to search his backpack and then arresting him. In that report, the Police and Complaints Commission said the RCMP need training in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The arrest was groundless. But the abuse and the mistreatment of people in a number of Indigenous land defenders cases, it's clear that there is greater violence directed towards people defending forests or fighting pipelines if they're Indigenous than if they're arrested with kid gloves the way I was so nicely by the RCMP on Burnaby Mountain. In the 30 seconds I have left, I urge everyone watching this debate tonight participating not to turn the page and think this was the debate for September 16th and now it's over. We have got to take this deeply seriously and ensure proper training, It's not a couple of rotten apples. It's systemic. Get them out of our police forces, protect Indigenous lives, and ensure that there is no place for racists where you're allowed to wear a uniform and carry a gun. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank the member for her important intervention. This debate is addressing what I feel like is a tip of the iceberg, and I think she agrees. There are so many examples of other issues of RCMP behavior. In my riding of Nunavut, I have whole communities that will not call the RCMP because they know that the RCMP will not address or protect that community from the violence that they're experiencing. We've seen other issues because of the RCMP's behavior towards Indigenous peoples, to the Black community. And there are stories after stories after stories. As complex as this is, I wonder if the member can talk more deeply about what some of the other challenges are, because I don't think it's just law enforcement. After this emergency debate was agreed to, was granted by the Speaker, I received a whole ton of social media, mostly in favor of the debate, but I also received a lot of vitriol, a lot of racism, saying, arrest them, arrest the Indigenous peoples. They're the ones who are behaving badly. And I wonder if she has any messages that she can share with Canadians, that this is not an Indigenous issue, that this is something that all of Canada must do to help make sure that it's not just something that we direct at the RCMP.
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for Nunavut for being a shining example in this place always of how to lead with love. I want to recognize that it's not one or two examples. As she was speaking, I was thinking of Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chippewa attacked by the RCMP in a parking lot. What we can do is remember the first call for justice of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, which was that all settler culture Canadians must read this report. It's on us, those of us who are settler culture Canadians, to face the truth. Truth and reconciliation starts with understanding the truth of 167 years of racism and genocide, and recognize that individuals here, settler culture Canadians, are very uncomfortable with the word racism because they say, well, gee, I'm not a racist. Yes, white fragility is also an issue. So let's work together at understanding the truth and figuring out how we together turn a page on a horrible history and move forward with love, guided by Indigenous wisdom, to love our Mother Earth, care for each other, and approach everything with the gratitude of heart, mind, and spirit connected.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député d'Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you to the Member for Saanich Gulf Islands for her display of humanity. She's showing that she is humane to this in the face of this topic that is a very sensitive one. I would also like to commend someone. I know she was the co-leader to a friend of mine that recently stepped down, but I would like to thank this person for their contribution to this debate. This person had social justice at heart, and I wish them all the best for their challenges to come. And that said, I think that a very simple, straightforward solution that the government could implement rather quickly at that would be to make Indigenous policing services an essential service. This would make sure that these police services have funding. What does my colleague think of this idea for the communities? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Thank you to my dear colleague, the Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. I'm very happy of the words that he said about my friend Jonathan Peglo, who has retired from his role as deputy leader of the Green Party of Canada. He took decisions, just like the member said, and always had a social justice and human rights lens to it. I think he's right. For Indigenous peoples, for Indigenous nations, and for Indigenous peoples, the best way to protect their communities is to have police sovereignty of First Nations and to have Indigenous policing. This is a question that all Indigenous peoples across Canada should be thinking about, but it's also something that I will believe as a non-Indigenous person. I will never trust the RCMP in these communities because I know that they are not there to protect our wellness.
Honourable member for Halliburton, Halliburton.